Common Ground was founded in 1991 when we purchased and renovated the Times Square Hotel. We currently own 11 properties and manage 2 additional properties, which comprise over 2,600 units of supportive housing in New York City, Rochester, and Connecticut. We also operate a scatter site program, transitional housing, and conduct street outreach in Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of Manhattan. We're fortunate to partner with some great agencies, CUCS, the Actors Fund, Good Shepherd, BronxWorks, and The Door, who provide social services on site at most of our permanent sites. We're also fortunate that we have robust staff, including 24-hour security at our permanent sites, which really helps in gathering and collecting a lot of the data that we use in these 2 tools. And although we're not a social service agency, we don't have access to health information or psych evals or things like that. We do try to look at as much data as we can and really use that to drive programmatic goals. There's a few databases that we use for these 2 tools that are really important. The first is MRI. It's an Intuit real estate software. We use this to track rent charges and payments, as well as no-pay cases. And MRI really forms the backbone of our database system because a lot of our other databases link to it. The next database is MTDB, or the Master Tenant Database. It's an internal database that we created that, as I said, links to MRI. It's the primary source for tenant information. It has information about subsidies, demographics, all kinds of tenant information, and it's also where we track holdovers. We also have the Incident Database, which, as it sounds like, tracks incidents. And then we have a web-based maintenance management software called Maintenance Connection that we use for work orders and apartment inspection tracking. So the data, as much as we can, we try to enter the data into these databases as events occur. For rent, we have monthly billing. We also have real-time information that we try to put in for payments or lack of payments. And we track court cases, the beginning, end, and intermediate steps of the process. Our security staff also try to document incidents as immediately as they can after they occur. Work orders are requested by tenants as they're needed. And then we also conduct apartment inspections 3 times a year and record those when they occur. We try to distribute this data in a number of different ways. Our incident reports they include social services on the distribution list, which allows for quick interventions as well as immediate feedback to security. We have an agency dashboard. We've talked about that a bit. That tracks a number of things. We also have a monthly financial meeting with each property where we sit down and we look at the financial statements for the building. And then on site at each of our properties, we do a regular meeting with our property management and social services staff together to look at tenant behavior and examine things that are happening in the buildings. We try to be very thoughtful about how we get staff to complete the data. One example is we encourage our maintenance staff to look at an apartment when they're in there completing a work order to note if there's any really problematic conditions, hoarding or a fire hazard. So we actually develop little cards that the maintenance staff carry around with them in their pocket, and they can fill it out very quickly and then report back to supervisors about a problematic apartment condition. We also try to close feedback loops with analysis of our data. One example is looking at exits from our housing and using that information and giving it back to staff to really help them inform decisions about taking people to court or engaging in certain practices. So now on to the specifics of the management index. The management index provides a complete picture of the tenants in our housing. We try to use objective criteria to determine their success, and it also helps us to highlight individuals that are in need of greater assistance. It helps us to focus on problematic areas in the building. If there's a drastic change, that might indicate that there's an issue. One example is if there's an increase in drug activity, that might lead to more incidents at that building. It helps us to get a snapshot of how many tenants overall are in greater need of services. One of the really nice features about the management index is that we don't have to do double data entry. The data is pulled directly from the databases, so staff don't have to track something separately or keep notes on the side somewhere. The index has also evolved over time. As our organization has grown and changed, we've kind of adjusted some of the focuses and different things. So the management index gives a score of 1, 3, or 5 in 5 categories, which I'll get to in a sec. The lowest score determines the overall score. So if you get a 1 in one category, your overall score is a 1. We calculate the scores monthly and distribute them. We have a quality assurance department that sends out the scores to all the program staff. And then we also track historical scores per tenant in the master tenant database. And finally, we track the number of tenants scoring a 1 on our agency dashboard. So we look at a 3-month period for the data. For rent, we compare the percentage of rent billed versus the amount paid. And tenants who are on representative payee automatically get a score of 5. We've done that because tenants, we feel that those tenants have utilized the services that are available to help them maintain their rent payments. For serious incidents, we look at certain categories of incidents. If a tenant has not been involved in any incidents, they get a 5. If they've been involved in 1 to 2 incidents, they get a 3. And if they've been involved in 3 or more incidents, they get a 1. For tenants who are in holdover cases, they get a 1, if basically any point after the notice to cure stage or later. And this includes the stipulation period after we've finished the formal court process. Apartment inspections, a tenant can receive a ranking of acceptable, borderline, or unacceptable, and the rating determines the tenant's score. And the last thing we track are work orders. We do want to encourage tenants to submit legitimate work orders for their apartments, but at the same time there might be excessive work orders that are put in, a tenant putting in a lot of work orders for the same problem, or a tenant might be going through a change, and we want to document that as well. For example, if someone needs a wheelchair and they need a lot of changes in their apartment, it helps us to say, okay, this was someone who was a little bit more service needy during the time period. So this is just a quick sample of the management index. You can see it's got the generic tenant names and then the individual scores in the categories and the overall score.
We have some of those folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And then this is a graph that's included on the distribution of the management index. It tracks the number of tenants whose overall score fell into the particular categories, and you can see how that's changed over time. But the good news is that for many of our residents, we're finding that they're in the 5 or the 3 category. There's very few who fall who receive a score of 1. Mentioned before the tracking individual tenant history, so this is just a sample of over time what the tracking report looks like. And this is helpful to go back and look at a tenant's history and see how they've changed while living in our housing. And then we might also pull out specific pieces of data, so we might look at the incident scores alone and track who are the people who were involved in some incident over time. So we use the management index to provide a quick snapshot of individual tenant behavior at that particular moment. We might use that to cross-check against other information. If their rent score is low, we might look back at their rent data. We also try to identify tenants most in need of help. And this ultimately helps us to determine strategies for targets for court cases or certain interventions with individual tenants. We also try to examine trend data for individuals. A few years ago, Common Ground made a commitment to serve chronically street homeless individuals. We've been able to track how well people have adjusted, individuals have adjusted to the housing using the management index. It also helps us to quickly identify decompensation or other issues. If a tenant suddenly spikes in incident reports, that might be a sign that there's something going on that needs to be addressed. We can also, on a macro level, determine the impacts of new policies or changing tenant populations, and we can also quickly review building information to get a current building snapshot and to compare buildings across each other. So now onto the serious incident tracking report. This was a report that we developed because we had some concerns about the nature and frequency of incidents that were occurring at some of our buildings, and we wanted to look at aggregate information and again to try to compare trends across different buildings. The incident report database uses incident types as well as checkboxes for emergency responders. So you might have an incident type of a physical altercation where NYPD and EMS also arrived. So there's kind of two different modes of tracking. The report examines the frequency of different incident types as well as the presence of emergency responders. We look at the rate of incidents per 100 residents, which allows for comparison across the different buildings. Our buildings range from 100 units to over 600 units, so that tool is important as well. And we look at historical trending data. So this is a sample of the incident tracking report. You can see on the top there's the 3 boxes, 3 sections where the different emergency responders are checked, and then the different incident categories underneath. And this is the same report, but looking at 100 incidents per 100 residents. and the historical data is available there as well. And then what we do is take this information and put it into a graph that helps us to compare the different buildings. So we can look at how the buildings compare to each other over time. And you might notice D and F have subsets. We've pulled out specific tenant populations there to look at their incidence and to track them. So we use this report to examine the number of serious incidents per building. We might need to modify or change our practices, such as setting different thresholds for court. We also use the data to help center staff and give perspective on how their building compares overall. We also try to compare incident rates across the different buildings to examine different populations and promote best practices in managing incidents. And then again, review trend information, looking at how many incidents are taking place during a certain time of year, or how we should devote resources during a building startup. These are two tools that we have that we use amongst many different tools, and they work best when we put them both together, which helps give a clear picture of incidents. The management index provides individual tenant data, and then the serious incident tracking report shows the frequency and types of incidents, so we can really pinpoint who was involved in which serious incidents over the course of a given time period. Other tools that we use include the exit analysis, which I mentioned earlier, that examines positive and negative exits from our housing, MTDB audits to make sure that we're keeping the data up to date as we should be, and then things like case note audits and service plan reviews, which ensures that we're meeting contractual requirements and meeting our obligations to funders. And finally, we have an incident review committee that examines best practices, training needs, and different things there. So thank you.